Today we're going to use latex paint and some primer on upholstery and see what happens. There have been a lot of videos out of chalk paint being used on upholstery, so we're going to see if it can be done with latex paint, which is what chalk paint is made from. So here we go. So first you want to wet your upholstery down. You can either brush it on or spray it on. You want it so it's not soaking wet, but you want it to be damp. I'm going to do this later because there's a stain, and I will show you how to do that. So I sprayed this. It is damp if you run your hand across it, but it is not sopping wet to where you can see water if you push down on it. I'm going to use latex satin paint. I mixed it 3 parts paint to 1 part water. And I'm going to paint over my wet fabric. You can use a regular paintbrush. If you have a chalk paint brush, and you want to use that, that's fine too. I use a paintbrush for everything, even chalk paint. So you want to work it across, up, down, every which way you can. You don't want a heavy coat of paint on here, but you want enough to just cover it. If there's any excess paint, it will end up being thick, and it just won't look good. So I'm putting on a fairly light coat. This is how watery my paint is when it's 3 parts paint and 1 part water. So it's fairly watered down. The reason I'm doing this is because I've had a few people ask me if upholstery could be painted with regular latex paint. And chalk paint is pretty expensive. A lot cheaper if you do it on your own, but the reason I wanted to try the satin paint is because when you paint with chalk paint, if you seal it with wax on furniture, it gives it a leather-like appearance, but my feeling has always been if you sit on something with a warm body and it has wax, that it will eventually warm up and possibly come off. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly seems plausible. So the reason I'm using the satin paint is because satin paint has a water and stain resistance, so that it won't just absorb every stain that gets on it. When you use chalk paint, you have to seal it because it is a porous paint, just like flat latex paint is. So we just don't want this to be susceptible to stains. Chalk paint is made from latex paint. It has things added to it that make it chalk paint. If you make your own chalk paint, you would normally add plaster of Paris or calcium carbonate. So if you're not going to paint the rest of your chair that is not upholstery, probably a good idea to tape it off or paint very carefully. Easiest really to tape it off. So I'm not going to treat the stain like I did the rest of the chair because water makes the stain run. So I'm going to use Kills primer, and I'm just going to put it straight onto the fabric. In doing that, I'm going to put it on really light because I don't want this to be a stiff place in this chair. Kills is not a really thick paint to begin with, so I'm just going to cover the stain with it. I'm going to let this dry for 48 hours before I come back because I want this paint to set up really well, and we're going to see what happens when you treat a chair like it's a wall. It's been 48 hours since I put paint on this chair, and we're going to see how it looks and feels now. It looks like fabric. It does not look like paint. This is a textured fabric, so you can still see the texture. You will always see the texture no matter what you do to a chair. It feels like, it feels a little bit stiff, but not tremendously stiff. If you sat on this chair, you would probably not know it had paint on it. You would just think it was a regular chair. So unless you're touching your chair, you wouldn't know that it has paint on it. The coverage is really, really good, but I think it's showing through a little bit the other color of the fabric, so I'm going to put a very light second coat. I'm going to use water again, but not quite as much as the last time. I do want to wet down what's there. This is an important thing I did not do on the first coat. When you are painting a chair with chalk paint, paint, dye, whatever you're using, you want to put a piece of paper down in the corners like this, so that when you paint down in here, you don't paint this and then come back and paint this part down here, because you'll have twice the paint in the corners as the rest of the piece, and it will show. So when you do each part like this, put a piece of paper or cardboard. If you had some thin plastic, that would work really well. But this will keep a buildup of paint from happening. You can see up here where I put the primer, up here along the edge, and down here. I'm going to wet all this down before I paint it. What I think is going to happen is that this part where the primer is will be a slightly different color than this, because it will have a different color background, and colors do shine through. Even the pale colors like this will show through. And I think that this section down here will probably look more heavily painted than this one. So we're going to see what happens. I wet this section a little bit more than this one, because this is the first coat on at least some of this. Alright, so the bottom has 2 coats and the top has 1 coat plus primer. Now we're going to wait another 48 hours for this to dry, and we're going to come back and see how durable it is. It's actually been about a week since I put paint on this chair, so everything is going to be good and dry. You can see a big difference. This is the primer and 1 coat of paint, and this is 1 coat of paint. What I think is going to happen when I put a second coat here, I still don't think it will be this color, because when you put white primer on something and you put a color over top of it, you see more of the true color of the color that you used. So it's also a good way to get your colors to pop no matter what you're doing, if you're painting furniture, upholstery, whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and wet this down to keep it consistent. I really think that when this dries, you're going to be able to tell a difference in between the primer. Making a mess already. Then you're going to be able to tell where the primer was, but we will find out. If it was a wall, I think you would be able to tell. So I'm going to let this dry overnight. It looks really uniform right now, but that does not mean that's how it will look when it dries. So we'll check back and see what we have. Alright, it's time to take a look at what latex paint looks like on upholstery. I see a lot of splotches in here. I can see the color of the fabric coming through, and I believe that is because latex paint does not have a primer in it, although you can buy some that is supposed to have primer in it. But the reason the chalk paint works is because it is basically has a primer in it. Interestingly enough, this is the back of the chair. The lower part is the part that had a primer first, and the top part has 2 coats of paint. So you can see the splotchy stuff in the top, but where the primer is on the bottom, it looks great. So I would say if you want to use latex paint, because it's a lot cheaper than commercial chalk paint, you can, but I would use a primer first. So let's look at how stiff this is and what the stain resistance is like. This chair feels stiff, not entirely stiff, but if you run your hand across it, you can tell. When you sit down in it, you really can't tell too much, but you can hear the paint. I've done some chairs in chalk paint and it is the same thing. So I think it's just you put paint on a chair, it's going to have that kind of thing. So let me ruin what I just did and rub some dirt in this chair. And put some ketchup on this chair. And see if we can clean this up. This definitely has the stain resistance I thought it would. You really can spill something on here and wipe it right off. I would say if you want to use latex paint on your upholstery, you certainly can. But I would definitely use a primer first. You can see how this is solid and this looks nice. It will have this kind of stain resistance because it is a satin paint. I would not do semi-gloss because it will be shiny and it will definitely look like paint if you use semi-gloss. I did go ahead and paint primer and another coat of paint on this. You're not really supposed to paint more than 2 coats of paint, but I wanted to see what the paint and the primer would look like. And it looks really good. It's got no more splotches. Of course you can hear it, but it's not crunchy. What you hear is the stuffing inside. So I would say if you want to go with paint and primer, you can definitely do that. You will probably get the same end results as chalk paint, except you will have something that repels stains because the chalk paint by itself won't repel stains, and Annie Sloan recommends not using the clear wax on fabric, so that leaves your paint unsealed with just regular chalk paint. So that's it for today. You can definitely paint upholstery with primer and latex paint. You could even have your primer tinted the color of your paint and get better coverage and probably do more of a color change if you wanted to. So please don't forget to like and subscribe and check back often. I put up new videos all the time. Thank you.